Oh boy. Awesome! Just like this intro. Hi everybody. About 12, 13 years ago I started physics modeling, if you can call it that, modding rFactor. And actually before that I was sort of making an ass out of myself on forums, RaceSim Central, shouting against the developers of rFactor that their physics was no good and didn't work and all that. And then I started slowly making tools in Excel, helping me to make physics. And since it's been such a long time and I've done quite a few projects, I figured let's make a video highlighting some of the spreadsheets I've worked on, the progress you can see there, how it went from modding to Reiza studios for racing teams, and just, an overview of what happened there. It's quite a bit like specialized video that a lot of you probably don't want to see, but perhaps some of you do. So let's see what we have. We don't need to save this. Well, we actually do. This is brilliant. Sorry. Oh, yeah. This you see, this is what I'm supposed to be good at. So in 2007, I was sort of struggling, trying to get some results from the physics, trying to get the handling more to my liking, and I quickly found out that sure, you can look at the files themselves and edit files and edit numbers, but that is such a complicated task. There are so many numbers there, and it's very hard to lose, easy to lose track of everything. So that's why I resorted to spreadsheets, Excel. I've used it at university in the early 2000s and I sort of figured, hey, this is useful because you can do a calculation over and over again with different variables, and that's very, very nice. If you bring out the calculator, 2 plus 2 is 4. Yeah, then that's easy, but if you do it again with different numbers, you have to always type it again. And with a spreadsheet, you can always have those calculations running in the background, change the numbers and see what the outcome is. So that was always something that I found very useful. And I've not prepared this very well. As you can see, that's my trademark. But here, for example, is one of those physics files from rFactor. So there are just so many numbers, and there was some sort of a rough description of what each of these numbers did, but it's also a bit, there's just a lot going on. It's so easy to make a mistake typing things out or entering numbers, and if you don't quite know what the number does, you're just sort of finding a needle in a haystack, you're sort of tweaking something, you don't really know what it does, you drive. If there's one thing you will achieve with this, is just mediocre physics at best. It's just, there's no control over, no overview, no control over it. So, time for some tools. But 12 years ago, my knowledge of physics was very, very limited. The difference there between then and now is that I kind of regarded myself then, reading my emails and stuff from then, as if I knew what I was doing. But in hindsight, now that 12 years later, I know a little bit about what I'm doing. But the most important thing I've learned is that when you think you know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing. So I've become a bit more modest. But I guess youthful exuberance is playing a part there. Anyway, here you have my first I could find spreadsheet from February 2007. A very ugly but hopefully useful way to make and change your ISI physics. This was sort of still planned to go public at some time, but eventually it didn't. So we have various tabs here where you can enter some parameters. And this was all sort of very early days trying to help you out. And this spreadsheet did not save complete text files, it just created some lines. So here we have the inertia line, and we also see that in the physics spreadsheet. So this is that line, sorry, in the physics text file, that inertia line. So eventually what this tool did was entering some numbers, and then it did some inertia calculations based on sort of inertia. This is 112 times yada yada yada. That's just a way to calculate inertia from a box. And then it looked at some other things and some other tweaks, and then at the end this came out. So for example, the length of the car, let's say it's a Formula 1 car, it's, I don't know, it's 5 meters, it's 1.5 meters, 0.6, that's fine. Whatever, that's probably fine. What's the weight? See, now I have to start here. Car info, weight excluding fuel, okay. Weight on rear, yeah. Okay, front track. Some properties there. Inertias. This is already looking like it's full of bugs, but hey, it's 12 years ago. Change some numbers, I don't know. And then, okay, this is sort of tweaked. Copy these cells, go back to your text file and paste in. Now we've made a change to an existing physics file. But we didn't just guess these numbers, they are the result of some most likely bugged, but whatever, at the time seemingly good calculations. So that was one way to make it easier to adjust parameters, and you know, there's no typo in this. All the brackets and commas, they're all correct, and that's something that screwed us up, like the modders in rFactor so many times. You're tweaking something and then suddenly the game crashes. Oh, you forgot a bracket or equal sign or a number somewhere. So this made it easier, more consistent to do that. Same for the springs and the dampers. There's lots of numbers here, things I could enter, the spring stiffness and lots of tweaks and stuff. It calculates a lot of stuff. I can adjust a lot of stuff, like the adjustability in the car setup menu in the game, how many steps you have to adjust something. And then at the end, these numbers, they come out, which are again part of this physics file. We have here the slow bump, fast bump, slow bump, so all the damper stuff, just like it is here. And you could copy paste this and apply it. So what this did is not only apply certain dampers, but also the adjustability of the dampers in the car setup, all relatively simply. So that was a first sort of rough attempt at making life easier and more consistent and more professional, rather than just try this number and see what happens. This is not much. There is some tire curve stuff here, but it's all very, very limited and not yet doing a lot. So this was my first, always being clever, my first spreadsheet that I made, more or less. And it sort of got the ball rolling because I felt at this point that this was the right track to be on in order to make more realistic physics, while not just chasing like a needle in a haystack, but actually being in control of the numbers by making the calculations in the spreadsheet and then spitting out the lines that go into the text files. Pretty clever, I thought back then, but there is more. No, let's not save that. I think we can do without. A few months later, it was a little bit more complete already. And I found lots of bugs and stuff. So there's still quite a bit of stuff going on here. With the inertia. Springs and dampers, they are the same. There is now anti-roll bars that you can set. All again with sort of a base rate, adjustability, the number of steps. So in the garage screen, you have all the stuff going on. It's pretty nice. And I added an engine to the mix. So rather than editing the engine file, which is not the most complicated file, but still the engine curve, these numbers. So easy to mess up, forget a comma, whatever. You can easily mess that up. And here I enter the torque and some other stuff, number of steps, engine braking, braking progressive. So this would create my torque curve. So the braking constant, well, let's see what happens. I haven't used this in 12 years. Ooh, so that's the blue is my engine braking curve, I suppose, which is either a constant value, just ramping up linearly, or it's progressive, or a mix of both. So the braking torque increases. You see, and what this does, it creates all these numbers with just 2 parameters. So that's so much easier than doing it all by hand. Super handy. Overall torque tweaking, like for drivetrain losses and stuff. And I just had to enter one torque curve. So here, you see, I'm making the curve, well, destroying it now. But see, you can make your shape here, and then at the bottom, this will be able to be copy pasted. Let's see if that works. It should work. Copy, and then paste. And this would, there's actually a bracket missing, but I didn't select enough cells. But that's how I would import this engine into the game. So a continuation of that first spreadsheet with more and more stuff. Gearbox added. How many gears do you have? And also the speed you'd like to hit the ref limiter at. So that's a very logical way to set a gearbox, isn't it? Just specify the speed you'd like to do, the shift points basically. And it will create the gear ratios for you. Again, these lines here. Copy paste into the gearbox file and copy these into your HDV file. And normally if you have to make a gearbox, it depends on the tire size and the revs of the engine, what sort of gearbox you need. So it's quite difficult to predict what gear ratio will result in 100 kilometers an hour top speed in first gear. So why not use a spreadsheet to just calculate it for you? And that was quite handy, and you can imagine the time it saves on making a car. So that's quite nice. Still no tires. I struggled with that. There's a bit of tire curves, but there's not a lot there. There's a bit of aero as well in this sheet, calculating some wings and stuff. So I would enter a car speed and I will get my aerodynamic forces there. And again, a whole bunch of aero parameters that go into the HDV physics file. So you can already see it's starting to expand, and it's starting to make more and more bits of the physics files. Quite, it's nice to see this after 12 years, and perhaps it's interesting to you to see how this slowly progressed from modding into the more professional stuff. So if we continue, here we have different color scheme, which is obviously very important. We're now somewhere in the summer of 2007. This is more of a total creator of tires. So you can make stuff here. So I think let's make some tires, if I remember, for a Corvette. I don't know, it's copies there, yeah, to high performance, track day, grip tweak. Well, we don't know if we have to tweak yet. So these are all the numbers you have to enter. And then there's this magic button. And then we create a new text file and paste. There is my entire tire file. Ooh. With the numbers we entered. The road tire generator O-matic. Yes, I read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where everything is an O-matic. So this is another step forward. It doesn't create just a couple sections of text files. It creates the entire file. Without typos, with all the numbers in place, based on relatively few input parameters. So this was another step up in that sense, and it created some graphs of slip angle and tire grip. And here there are some calculations. It's all a bit messy, and I don't even know what's going on here, to be honest, but I'm sure something is. Based on all these numbers you enter here, things will change and it will create an entire file for you. And here is more stuff. So by this time it's getting a little bit more complex, and it's taking more random work and more boring work away. And I can focus more time on creating tires by changing the parameters rather than changing all those numbers. So that's another nice step up. And this was the time when we released the Corvette C6 mod for rFactor. If you're very old, you might know that. So this is so old. This is my student apartment. 11.6 square meters back in 2007. Very cheap though. I got no debt as a student because my room was cheap. No 4C back here even. It's all very old school. Actually a prototype H-pattern shifter. So guess how long the prototypes of that thing have been in the works. rFactor single screen. Over the shoulder cam. Potato camera. 320 by 200 I think. And this was the first result of some of these physics tools. Well, you can watch the videos on my channel, you know where to find that. Let's make myself a bit smaller, finally. Because we get to the serious shit now, folks. So this Corvette that I built with Sim, Anouk, who we later went on to do the Toyota Supra. And Sim even did a little bit of work for Reiza Studios at the end with some cars. This was like sort of the heyday of modding for rFactor. Really high quality models, and with these physics, finally, instead of hating the physics in rFactor with all these tools and just hours and hours and hours of messing about, the car started to handle more like I felt was realistic, not that I have any clue what realistic would actually be. But it was a sort of the first release, and would not have happened without these tools. Also, definitely would not have happened without Chris Hoyle, who later went on to make rFactor Pro, because the tool he worked on was Car Factory. You could create suspension geometry and stuff with that. It was a very important modding tool for rFactor as well. So that combined with my tools really sort of raised the bar, subjectively for me anyway, made it fun to create cars for rFactor. But that was like 12 years ago, so what else have we been up to? Well, all these snippets that you saw here, one file created, it still was a bit scattered, right? So it would be nice, we are another few months later, to have a more complete tool. And I started working on this late 2007. Another change of color scheme. It still was the plan to go public, although I had no control over what I was doing. It was sort of getting out of control a little bit. Lots of buttons, most of which probably some work. So here I set a lot of parameters here and get some numbers, and it's gradually becoming more complicated. But it's also like, yeah, lots and lots and lots of numbers. Lots and lots and lots of numbers. So this didn't happen overnight. This was a year or so worth of combining knowledge and messing about. And for example, the tire curves are now easy to make. So I have here show curve. There are 8 curves, I believe. So curve 1 is this line there. And if you would like to make a new curve, I could just make a curve. So I don't know, let's just make, let's say this is a nice curve. I could save it as 5. Whoopsie. And then I don't know, make a different curve. this save as 6. And now if I show curve 5 and 6, whoa, these are the ones I just created. And I can then apply these curves if I wish to, I think, here. I assume that somewhere I haven't used this for 12 years, right? Somewhere I can set which of these curves I'd like to use in the tires. I've just got no idea where, but hey. Oh, front tire curves, yeah. Here, front tire curve, build-up shape. 3, 4, 5. This is the one we just created. So I can change the curves of the slip curves of the tire, enter all sorts of parameters, see all sorts of plots of what's going on. So this is quite another step forward in realism and trying to get a view of the physics. I mean, this tells you something, well, probably doesn't tell you a lot, and secretly it didn't tell me that much either, but compare that to this. I mean, this doesn't tell you anything. It's just numbers, and that's very hard to see. But this, you can, oh, right, I can see some grip increase and drop and some stretching, shrinkage, camber stuff. It being more graphical and more easy to sort of look at and see your changes, not just in numbers, but in a curve shape. It's just so much easier to work with. So this is another very, very big step, although it still doesn't make complete files because I think I got bored or sidetracked, probably sidetracked. Because what happened by then, after the Corvette, I got in touch with the Historx mod guys, if you remember. Lots of historic touring cars from the 60s and 70s. Awesome mod, if you ask me, sort of GT Legends, if you know that game, those cars. And I got involved with them. And then suddenly the task wasn't just to make a car, but it was to make 9 cars or 10 cars. I don't know how many it was. And I figured, geez, how am I going to make 9 or 10 cars when I barely have the ability to make one? I have to step up my physics tool game here. So I tried to do that. And here we are. So the whole thing with the physics stuff is there are so many parameters, as you've seen, and just changing them one by one is silly. And then how about doing that for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cars? That's just 9 times as stupid. And if you have a physics tool that makes 1 car, sure, that's nice, but then you have to make 9 cars. That's still a lot of work, and it's very hard to see what you're doing. Like having that overview, what have I done to each car? What are the rules for the tire grip, stuff like that. And with this tool, this is actually the tracks that you may have seen in some videos or earlier stuff, makes multiple cars from the same spreadsheet. And the basic theory here is that I don't create tires for each car so much as that I have rules somewhere. Well, sort of, tire bits. It's all a bit small fonty, but heat and wear stuff is here. Tire curves, that's pretty much the same. So you can subtle changes in tire curves, you can save them, do some checks on the curvature shape. But hang on, I got this. Sort of. Yeah. Here I simplified some of the tire stuff. So rather than setting the grip and the load sensitivity of each tire individually, I have some rules. So there is the base width of the tire, 250 millimeters, and then something with grip and load sensitivity and how it changes with tire width. So here I took the width of the tire and based my tire properties on the width. So if I make a different tire for a different car, it will have a different dimension and it will get different properties based on these sort of rule makers. So here I can plot 4 tires. So the patch width, well, let's make 50%, there's a wide tire, 50%, there's a 250 and 200, 50, 50. That doesn't fit. There we are. Let's not overdo it. There's some stuff here that I'll just briefly delete so everything becomes a bit more easy to understand. Right, so here are 4 tires. 50% grip, which is just a subjective thing, and a few different, so narrow tire to a very wide tire. And here you can see the grip versus load curve of the widest tire and then the narrowest tire. And the dotted lines are longitudinal. And this is quite important because these rules that I've set here, what happens when the tire deviates from its base, the width of the tire, it changes the grip and the load sensitivity. So rather than changing each tire individually, I have these rules that create all sorts of tires. And this is quite simple, of course, but it's easy to tweak and very logical. So in the main input, where a lot of stuff happens, I have this, the width of the tire, the contact patch width, the rolling resistance modifier, tire aspect ratio, that sort of stuff. So just the width of the tire looks at all this, all these numbers and creates the load sensitivity. That's quite easy to do this. And I can look at some of the performance curves, like the cornering stiffness, the load sensitivity, lateral longitudinal, how the slip angle changes, and I can do this for various cars, car 2. It doesn't really tell me what car this is. Corvette. So I can quickly look at what the properties of the tires are for each vehicle. So this whole rule thing is very important here. Rather than doing all the parameters for each car, just set up some rules that look at a small number of parameters and then derive all the other parameters from it. That's quite important. What else is there here? I'd like to, yeah. So for example, the peak, now is load. Haven't looked at this for a very long time, remember that. So this is the Porsche 911S, and I can look at a different car. It's the Cobra 289, and then it has different tire curves. The Ferrari, whatever it is, the Healy, Austin, the Alpine, great car. So multiple cars in one sheet. Very nice. And it does add up to quite a lot of numbers. This is quite complicated in the sense that there's this many cars and main car bits, wheel by all the numbers, center of gravity, heights, dimensions, bug compensation. There was a bug in rFactor regarding inertias. Collision feelers, under tray, tire stuff. Some like calculations done on it. Here there is the tire stuff, the grip levels, all going into this one. Because what if we take an average tire, 250 wide. We have 0. So this is what it would look like if you change the grip parameter. So you have the same tire width, but you change it between 0% all the way up to 100% grip. And you see how the load sensitivity changes, all from logic that I've applied here. So not only does this work, apparently, possibly, it can also save all the files with one click. And that's neat, to say the least. There's a lot more actually here. It's like, keep scrolling down with the tires. the different curves we used. You could see we made some different shapes of curve, and I can set all those curves here, and I can go to the various sections, create my own drop-off curves, front curves, rear curves, front versus rear, important, main screen. You see that navigates quite smoothly. And more variables, suspension, calculating the spring, the ride frequency, with actually you enter the ride frequency and it will calculate the spring rate for you, and it will create dampers based on the critical damping. So there's a lot of stuff being automated, or at least made easier, because how do I know what sort of dampers I would need for a certain car? It depends on the weight of the car, the stiffness of the springs, and here by using a percentage of critical damping, it's quite consistent, and I just have to enter the percentage and it will come up with a damper that's 5,000 Newton per meter per second or something. Something about the travel, bump travel, the alignment, aerodynamics. So some simple aero, some calculations for the aero. And here's something that I didn't quite understand that well at the time, but how the ride height changes with the downforce. This is a bit, I don't think I understood it too well back then, and I certainly don't do that anymore now. More aero, brakes, based on the g-force. Again, that's quite nice, because I know probably reasonably well what the g-force will be that I want to pull on the brakes, but I don't know how much torque the brake will have to apply, each brake disc have to apply in order to get there. So by entering a g-force, which I know, it will calculate the required torque. So that's another big time saver. It also makes everything consistent, because here each car, I can give it a certain amount of expected brake performance or brake strength, which is very consistent. And if I set each of these cars to 0.9, they will brake at 0.9 G, provided there is enough tire grip, but it might result in quite different actual brake strength. So a light car might, with small tires, might only have like 2000 Newton meters of brake torque, but the heavy car, in order to decelerate at 0.9 G, might need double the brake torque. So that's something that's hard to calculate, but with a spreadsheet, enter the g-force, out comes the brake torque. Very handy. Well, and then for engines, simple torque curve, just using a few points, and then it creates a torque curve showing Cobra 427. So let's look at the Alpine, showing Alpine. So that's this one. And then I can change this, I don't know. Like that, perhaps? Perhaps like that, I don't know. Oh, it's bad. Why is it bad? Because now we changed a number, which means that the peak power no longer occurs where we wanted it to. So here we set the power, 150 horsepower at this RPM, this torque at this RPM. And again, being a spreadsheet is super handy if you program it in, if you code it in. If you enter numbers here in the torque curve that exceed the power or torque you want it to have, it can throw you an error message. Bad. So all works out okay. Change the engine of all cars. The engine braking is also a constant number, the percentage of the peak torque. So that should be fairly consistent. Something about the engine lifetime calculations here. So you can see exactly what revs the lifetime of the engine is 1 second. In other words, you pretty much blow it instantly. All in overview for all these this group of cars. So that's quite nice. Well, drivetrain, of course, which wheels are driven, how strong is the clutch, and it looks at the engine for the torque that it has to transmit. Adjustability of the differential. Gearbox, again, a few different types, which is quite nice. So I can configure the gearboxes here. I have a couple of types, which are some curves with the speed that the car does with the gear that you're in. And based on that, it will sort of spread out the gears in a certain way. gear ratios if you want to enter them and have them adjustable here. AI stuff, pit menu stuff is sort of the leftover stuff, all the suspension stuff, which I used Car Factory for. Already mentioned that. That's the tool made by Chris Hoyle. So everything is here. Geez, quite a lot. And in the end, yada yada yada, tool rFactor XL. Quite a clever, relatively clever thing. Let's see, does it work? Let's save some of these files. I'm not sure if it's gonna work. Yeah, okay. I just made this folder, so it should exist. Now I hope, always a bit scary, can I press this button and will it work? Yeah. So I saved the Porsche 911S and I've saved the Alpine. The date appears when I last saved it. And now we have the files here. So let's look at a file that we just created. So it's Porsche 911. This is the date code, which is date for Excel. And here all the stuff is saved in the right folder with a bug. I see things that are wrong. Oh well. It was 12 years ago. But I don't think I have to explain how easy it is. Let's look at the Alpine tires. How easy it is to have it like this. All the stuff infinitely adjustable from the spreadsheet tool, saved directly to the physics files. And then you can start the sim and drive. So this was sort of the major spreadsheet. And what I was quite sort of proud of this was pushing boundaries. And one of the things I started doing was some macros. So all these navigation stuff that you have here, these buttons, load sensitivity, that bring you to the right screen, are actually macros here. Visual Basic, and that's something that will ramp up. The more advanced, the more we go through the years, the more of this I will use. So very relatively simple. All the macros did was go to a new screen or change the plot, what sort of range it should plot, that sort of stuff. So there's no real calculation going on, but just if I click a button to show a certain chart, then it would sort of select the range and make it visible in the chart. So there's quite a bit of very cumbersome navigation stuff and chart stuff here in Visual Basic. So this was the beginning, the very, very early beginning of Visual Basic as well. So this was all good and well. And by this time, Reiza Studios had also started more or less. So the Formula Armaroli mod that we did for rFactor and some of the first cars for Game Stock Car were made using this version of the tool. Let's sidetrack a little bit now, going towards more like the professional stuff, because I did modding and Reiza Studios, but also some work for racing teams. And I've prepared a couple of these files where I removed all the all the sensitive bits, hopefully. And this was at the time where everybody, if you're not a Formula 1 team, you used rFactor for your race simulator. So all the GP2, Formula 3 teams, they used rFactor, and some of them still probably do. Or Automobilista or rFactor 2, whatever it is now. And I saw there was a market for making a tool for racing teams that would allow them to set up the car easily with numbers that they knew and understood, and then they could launch a simulator and have a go. And the thing that struck me was, with all these tools that you've just seen, how complicated and how many numbers there are, there's just no way that a race engineer at a GP2 team has the time and the years, because by this time we're a year or two in, to understand all this stuff, even if he could, which he probably could, but you cannot afford to spend a couple of years full-time working on the simulator because, well, unlike Formula 1 teams, all the Formula 3 GP2 teams have no money. They have money, but there's not like, oh yeah, let's hire some extra guys for a simulator. That's very rare. So I figured let's make a tool where these teams can use their car more or less in the simulator. So what would happen? I would create the base car for them. In this case, it was for a GP2 team. They give me all the data, I sign all the NDAs and stuff, and everything you see here is fictional. I've changed all the numbers, this has nothing to do. This was also 2010, so very old GP2 car. So they gave me all the data with which I created sort of a base car, and then I gave them this tool, which allowed them to set up the car in the way they were used to. And this is the main setup screen, so they could change the weight, ballast, all pull-down menus, the weight distribution, whatever it was, with the kilograms of fuel. Very nice. Set the gear ratios, all selectable. Go for engine efficiency, so if there's some more losses from high altitude or that sort of stuff, they could change the engine power, engine braking, the rev limit, differential stuff. And now we get to the suspension, and this is where real cars differ from the sim, because we have in the sim you change the front anti-roll bar, it's 200 or it's 300. But in real life, it's probably, oh yeah, it's the 30mm bar, the thin one, position 3, hole 1. That's what they're used to. And if the rate is 200 or 300, they don't know. So I figured out I have to get a way of translating what they're used to back into the simulator. So how does that work? Well, there are lots of options here. Again, all this stuff is random. It's not actual data, because I don't want to get the mafia knocking on my door. Selectable gear ratios. This is all the stuff you can select from the car setup menu. And going to suspensions, here we have the front springs. And you can name them or not. I mean, I can apply a value to it and I can name them. So if I don't know, does this work? I guess. Farts, smelly, never, tacos again. That's rather stupid, but let's see. Springs. See, now I can select the farts springs, and the farts springs is a value of 12 kilograms per millimeter. These are also adjustable. So I can specify they can specify the units, whatever they want, and enter the units as they are. And then name them, because parts are not always named to have like the same value in the name. It's like the anti-roll bars. These are the positions of the anti-roll bar, and they correspond to a certain value in a certain unit. And depending on if you measure it at the bar, at the ground, all sorts of stuff. And here the front anti-roll bars are set by name and not by value. So this is something they can basically copy the setup sheet that they used at the real track enter all the ride heights, the travels, by name or by value, whatever, and go by that. Same for dampers. Here they have the damper curves, and they typically have a sort of a name for that as well. And that means there are certain bump and rebound damper curves. These are again all fictional. And I can see so now it shows set 1, and you just set the various points here, or show set 2. And you can create a whole list of dampers here. So this would be handed over to the sim guys at the racing team. They could set their units, because sometimes the damper dyno works in inches. And all these unit stuff is quite important. Of course, have to be translated back to rFactor units, typically just metric. So at the background, everything is converted back to the right units. So lots of stuff they can select for the travel and the weights and steering ratios, everything like that is adjustable here. There's a thing with rolling radius, complicated ways to make it more realistic. Aero as well, very important on racing cars, of course. And here I would have all the data from the wind tunnel, from Dallara in most cases if it was a single seater. Again, this is not a Dallara aero map, I randomized it. So this would be the place where you would enter the actual Dallara or whatever your manufacturer was, all the tables of ride height, rear ride height, front ride height, total downforce, aero balance and drag. This would come straight from like the car manual or a spreadsheet that you get from the manufacturer. You would put that in here, and there would be space to have lots of them, like a low, mid and high downforce. And then here at the aero tab, there are some things you can do. Apply certain, I don't know, wing settings, 40, 60, and you see things change, drag. And these wing settings and the drag settings will change the aero parameters that will be saved to the physics files later. And here you can compare it. So this is one of those maps from the real data. This isn't, like I've been repeating myself many times, just random data here. So here you would compare that. So you knew I want to achieve this map here, these numbers. And here you could change the numbers. In this case, this will be pointless until the difference is almost 0. So all these numbers should be about 100%. And I can show you that, but this is a pretty good area of rFactor. Its ride height sensitive aero is quite good, and you can approach real life within like 1% or 2. So you would change this. See, now it's 100%. Oh, the balance is 70%. That's bad. My balance is way too far rearwards. Let's see if we can see now. That's better. Yeah, let's try to match them up. I can't do drag. Can I do negative? Yeah, I can. Okay, let's just random look. Let's just look at these numbers. They're highlighted numbers and make them 100%. The map will have a different shape, so all these numbers will be different. But you have to believe me that everything was like 100%. So now we've gotten fairly close with these numbers for aerodynamics. So let's say this is what I'm happy with, because it's 89%. Well, I'm a bit picky, aren't I? So right now my drag is 100%, so it matches real data. The rear wing, the balance is almost good. I have a bit too much downforce. Yeah. Now I have too little drag. Yay, we managed. So now you adjust this, and then if these were real numbers, you would see them on the whole being very close to 100%, meaning that the simulator now matches the real map that we compared to perfectly. So then you would say 2019, yay, we did it. the front wing is 76, the rear wing is 33, and the drag is minus 60. So now we created this aero setup, which we can then apply. So we have an air density value here, which will further multiply the aero stuff and increase the drag and downforce if you go for thicker air. And now here we have 2019, yay, we did it. And it will now apply these aero parameters to the car. So what they would do is save the files. And off they would go. And behind the scenes here, all the files are made. This was actually done in a combination of having HDV files there. And this would basically save the upgrades file, which changed a lot of the settings again and changed and also saved the entire tire file and some other stuff. So it's a mix of using full physics files and also using the upgrades file to change certain things. So save the files, launch your simulator, and you are driving the car with this setup. Pooh, quite elaborate, isn't it? Anyway, this was quite good, and this has been used by only two race teams. How much work was this? Only 2 customers. Oh dear. I'm a commercial failure. Anyway. Very interesting exercise though, to do this and to figure this out. This is all a bit complicated, don't you think? So another thing I saw were like not so much race teams, but sim centers where they wanted to do some driver training, but not necessarily wanted this level of detail. So yeah, you want a good model that you can play with, but not so complicated. And that's when in 2011, we just left 2010 behind, I made some standard models. These were barely sold because, well, I'm much better at making stuff than selling it. Where they could change the setup in a very simple way and tick box some stuff. And I would sell generic models for GT cars, single seaters, stuff like that. So if you had a generic driver training simulator and you didn't really care if the front anti-roll bar was exactly the same as the real car, you just want a nice car, good base handling with some adjustability, you could change some things here, like understeer everything, the brake bias to the front, high downforce, okay. Save this car setup, slot number 3, enter a name, under stereo. So now we've just adjusted these sliders, saved it, and then I can select a setup via GT3, it will apply it, under stereo, it will apply it, and start simulator, it won't work now, which would even start launch your sim. And I don't know if you know runtime, Jamie, it's Spanish, I cannot pronounce Spanish stuff. He did the UI for the Historx mod and he changed the UI for me, so it's only allows you to start the sim and go to track. So the UI was very much simplified. Start the simulator, go on track and drive this thing. And this was a nice sort of toolbox for engineers to quickly change the handling of the cars and not mess about with the physics files, which is just a recipe for disaster. Very easy to make mistakes. And of course, there's no spreadsheet complete without lots and lots of numbers and calculations and files and stuff. But I show you some of that already in the other ones. So that was generic cars, very nice handling, sort of basic cars, easy to adjust and launch a simulator aimed for sim centers. So yeah, I don't think I've shown you this ever. Then, what I didn't do yet, those Historx cars, they were sort of cool. You can always check see my channel for some videos. So these were those 9 or so touring cars, all made with the same spreadsheet. Porsches, BMWs. Brings back memories, that's for sure. Imagine tweaking, if I can go back to this for a second, because now I'm intrigued again. Just imagine the power you have when you tweak from the spreadsheet. So that BMW, I don't know, is it here? It's not even here, this is not, that's another batch of cars, but you find your car here, find its column, change it, save it. Or what if overall the tires are too grippy? Think, all right, so let's hang on, I got this. So here are some tires, let's say the wide car tires and the narrow tires, they're all too grippy. So I think, well, let's lower it a bit. And then all tires will get a bit less grip, logically based on their dimensions. What if I think, well, these downsloping lines are a bit too steep. Well, let's change it a bit, you know. See how that works? So that's so easy to make tweaks globally to all the cars and stay completely on top of them. And if there's feedback from the beta testers, they say, the cars have too much this or too much that, I can quite easily change it for every one of them. So yeah, this was such a nice tool to work with back in the day. But only so detailed, but still very nice. You know, you might think that you need more and more detail, more and more complexity, but there is only so much that fits into this. And I'm sure there are more clever physics guys out there, but there is just a limit to the stuff you can comprehend and the stuff you can control at the same time. So tools that simplify the workload might seem simple, but the end results could be way better because it's a system you understand and you have control over, rather than a more complicated system, more complicated physics, more files, more numbers that you just cannot comprehend completely, let alone have an overview of. So that's the balancing. Do you want more complexity? Okay, but do you still understand it? Perhaps for one car. What about a group of cars? Do you understand everything at the same time for all these cars? And what if you have to change something? You have so much work to do, and this makes it easier. Anyway, so we had lots of tools now, and then the pro stuff dried out a little bit because I didn't care too much for actually supporting and selling this rather than making it was what I like to do most. But I still figured there is more to be done in like the professional or more high detail stuff. And this tool started in 2012, I suppose. And it's the one that I'm using these days for Automobilista, which is very specific again. So we went from multiple cars in one spreadsheet down to one car in a spreadsheet, but at a far greater level of detail, which has benefits and drawbacks, as I'll come to in a bit. So this has been updated over the years, so I can now add the turbo model that we have. I can add the throttle torque model stuff that we did. There's a lot more going on, and it's also a lot less incorrect, hopefully. It has suspension geometry. It has quite detailed aero maps and curves and stuff. So there's a lot more going on. Probably the most important thing that's going on here though is actual code. So I showed you some simple macros that I use to navigate to certain parts of the spreadsheet. Well, it still happens here, but here, for example, the aero calculations. At all these ride heights, all the aerodynamic forces are calculated, and these are all the numbers that decide what the aero stuff will be. those calculations are no longer done like here in different bits. There is still stuff here, but most of it is now done in code. So, well, it takes, this is what I've learned over the years, to do actual programming in Visual Basic, which is so much easier and so much more convenient than doing it in the spreadsheet itself. You can name stuff far easier and do calculations in small steps. It's just so nice. So here it looks at all the numbers, where they are in the spreadsheet, and then it does calculations, all the lift, downforce, drag, all that stuff. So there's a lot more code going on, and that's something I've really learned to do a little bit, and it really helps a lot. So there's just a lot more I don't even know most are empty. Still a lot of chart stuff, but there's a lot of code as well. Yeah, some more code. If then else, spring deflection, helper springs, bump rubbers. So this is all for the ride height calculations from the downforce. Doing this in the spreadsheet, like 1, 2, I know something isn't right. It equals this plus that. You know, that's one way to do the calculation, but if it gets more complicated, soon it becomes too difficult for me to understand anyway. And that's where being able to code things in spreadsheet and Visual Basic has been a big help. And that's really something that is enjoyable as well. It's a nice challenge. So that's sort of where it ends almost. This is the latest spreadsheet that I've made, and so the trend that we saw was we went from simple spreadsheets that created just a little bit, like a couple of lines here and there for the physics files for one car, to creating entire physics files for a number of cars, but then they were relatively simple. Back to the high detail, one car at a time thing. And now, this is sort of interesting to relate back to the current state. I should have announced this, making my face bigger again. But what I never expected with Reiza Studios is that we would have this game, stock car, for 9-8 years. So you can imagine that during those years, your knowledge changes a lot, and you make lots of mistakes that you later find out how bad they were. Because during that time, it's great. You learn more, you get better. But the content in the sim sort of stayed the same. So some of the cars in Automobilista are very old. They've been updated to some extent and improved to some extent, but the base first generation of it could be 8 or 9 years old. And that's something, well, you've read that Automobilista 2 is announced. That's great. And I'm not too involved with that because of a number of things, just really busy with the hardware stuff. And I have to rewrite everything. I want to go back to that spreadsheet that does multiple cars at the same time. I think that's the only way to do a new sim where you have all the cars in one spreadsheet with complicated but clever rules that calculate the tire grip, the suspension stuff, everything. Way more complicated than this. But you remain in control of all the content in one sort of overview. And if you make changes over the years, or you learn more over the years, you update the spreadsheet and you can save all the files with all the latest developments. So you don't get this fragmentation of, oh, this is a car from 2011. Oh yeah, 2 years later I understood suspension's better, so this car is better because the suspension is better. If you had a system like this, but then updated to my modern standards, you would not have that. You have far more consistent, and that's a bit ironic because of course Automobilista is quite praised for being relatively consistent in its physics quality, which is because Renato and me have worked very hard on it for 8 years. So it's not like it's terrible, but I'm never happy with the way physics are. It can always be improved. And looking back, since we had the games so long, and since the modern games tend to, I mean, look at iRacing, it's 10 years old. rFactor 2 is 6 years, 7 years old by now. Games are out for a long time, and if you sign off on the individual physics files and then improve the game, it's very hard to go back and improve the old stuff. And having it all in one spreadsheet is the way forward. But imagine rewriting it at this level, but a spreadsheet that does 100 cars or 50 cars just fine. It's what I'd have to do, and that means a total rewrite of everything. And it also means that some of the physics code, the physics models, have to be compatible with it. And I'm convinced that with Automobilista 2, there is no drawback in the physics engine that is used at all. It is complicated and probably easily up to the task of surpassing Automobilista. But it has more of a physical tire model, CETA, I think it's called. And that's not a model that I like to work with in general. Same with rFactor 2, that's the reason I'm not modeling for rFactor 2. Because these physical tire models are so complicated, there is no way you can draw easy curves up for the grip and then change some tire properties and see the curves again. So it's even harder to be in control of a group of cars with those complicated models. And then you have that question, do you have a slightly less complicated model that you understand and you have a tool where you can create 50 cars in 50 days? Or do you have a more complicated model that's theoretically probably better, but it's so hard to work with that in 50 days you've done 1 or 2 cars and then you have to keep them up to date over the years. So it's a balance, and I feel with my knowledge that over the years my knowledge has improved, but that, like I said, also meant that, wow, the more you think you know, it's quite likely that you don't know anything, because there's always so much more to know. So being modest there about what you can understand and control, I'm leaning towards, okay, let's have very high quality but relatively simple models and have the tooling in place that creates consistent, very consistent cars that are very easy to tweak. And if you then create a new tire model or improve the aero model, roll it out over the entire car base, and each car will benefit at once from the new updates. That philosophy is something I feel very, very strongly about, and I cannot really do that in a short amount of time with an engine that isn't suited to it. So I'm, in the meantime, sort of thinking about this because I love physics. If you couldn't tell by now, I mean, I spent 12 years locking myself indoors working on tools. So I still really love this, and I'm currently looking at ways to make that ultimate physics tool where I can create multiple cars and be in full control of them without compromising the realism. And then perhaps at some point it can be applied to a game when there is more time to build the game, which for Automobilista 2, it just wasn't possible to do it in the time frame that's available with the models that the sim has. So my vision was a bit hard to apply there. So I'm consulting a little bit. We've always had good contact at Reiza with the guys, and if I can help with something, I'll definitely try. But I'm more hands-off than I was with Automobilista. And in the meantime, I have actually started, you have to start somewhere. And a tool that I want to create isn't so much limited to Automobilista or whatever. It's more the method of doing things, and then you can apply it to whatever the sim model is. So I am actually working on stuff which you may or may not ever even see, but just to show you that in the meantime I have done stuff. Why am I even showing this? It's all a bit of a mess, but hey. So here, for example, if this works, is an engine creator that I've recently made. So I started in like January, February, just see if I can break down engine, tires, suspension, that sort of stuff in chunks. See if I can come up with a way to relatively easily make an engine that is adjustable without having to do all the parameters, because the engine stuff in Automobilista is quite complicated now. There are so many numbers. So I broke it down. I just went for a coding session. And this is now really something. Might as well give you a little bit. So there is, I've programmed how to make an engine torque curve with certain shapes and drop-offs, and even have a bit of noise in the torque curve. There is turbo modeling programmed a little bit, and throttle mapping, torque mapping. Is there anything else? And now I can enter some numbers. It's still working. It's really slow. Still working. Something's not right. Calculating. It's still doing something. It's really slow. I don't know what that is. That's slow. Let's close this one. Oh dear. Did I break it? Possibly. It shouldn't be that difficult though. Yeah. Phew. Finally. So in the background there's code working, and I have some parameters here. This is just a rough example. I'm sort of going randomly left and right. It's very ugly at the moment as well. What you see here is a torque curve at 5% throttle intervals. And these are the numbers that control the torque curve, the shape of the curve. So I can change the initial torque, the idle RPM, the peak torque. Let's make it 500. Peak torque RPM, 8500. Peak power, 610. Our RPM 10,000. 0. See, now I can change the shape of the torque curve which is a very high detail, high resolution curve. But I only change a couple of numbers. Whether I'm using this or not, I don't even know in the end, but just some way that makes it easier, because the stuff that is generated here is insane. Because all these curves have their own sort of input in the final file. Sorry, gonna take a while. Well, if you're still here, you're nuts anyway. You might as well wait around for a little bit more. Yeah. So what is created here? I just changed some numbers, and you saw it change shape a little bit. Is we not only the torque curve, but also here all these numbers. There's a lot of them, and they're all created from just a couple of numbers that I enter here. So that's quite interesting. So I am working on stuff, and I have a lot more done actually. Since we are giving you a peek now anyway, which is not really structured, but Let's see. No, Niels, that's not it. People are falling asleep. Yeah, I know. Ah, look. Now this is nicer. So you saw all those tire curves that I made in the previous spreadsheets. This is actually running off the same code that actually runs rFactor and Automobilista. So this is just a copy of the code, of the source code. That's why I cannot show you the code. But for the first time, yeah, I know we've been using this engine since 2007, but for the first time I can actually plot combined slip, so you have lateral and longitudinal wheel slip at the same time, all sorts of conditions, friction ellipse, that sort of stuff, for the first time in ever. And this is quite insightful because it showed me a couple of things that I didn't know, and hence showed me ways to make the tires even better and more realistic. So the code here it's significant, and I've already spent a few months on this, so I'm slowly sort of understanding the engine at an even deeper level, and then making tools that simplify the creation of tires, engines, and that sort of stuff. I will continue with this because it's fun, it's my hobby, and who knows, perhaps by the end of the year or something, I have my mega tool that creates Automobilista quality cars in a matter of minutes. And then if it's 1, 20 or 50 cars, it doesn't matter. The tool should be able to handle as many cars as you need. So yeah, that's my mad scientist maniac project I'm working on now. But I hope that was sort of an interesting overview in oh yeah, my face is big. Well, you can still see something. An overview of what I've done over the last 12 or so years with spreadsheets. Wow. Just when you thought Niels couldn't get more boring, he uploads an hour-long or so video of... Jeez. Anyway, guys, I hope that was sort of interesting. I'm sort of thinking, have I forgot anything? I don't think so. Probably I have. If this raised more questions than it answered, post them down in the doobly-doo. AVE. Who's he? And I better get back to doing some actual work. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.